GT7 1.55 is here, and as always it's time for my initial thoughts and overall review, if you will, on day one of it. Of course we're going to talk about each vehicle in a more in-depth way in the following days, starting tomorrow, wherein of course we'll be getting deeper into the engine swaps and then the individual cars afterward. For now, let's talk about the cars, the physics changes, if notable, of course stuff like glitches or notable point level changes on particular vehicles. I don't have the time to jump into every single aspect and double check every single car, so if you guys have noticed anything interesting or weird or a change there, of course that's where the comments below come in. For the briefest version of my thoughts though, I find this to be something which I kind of referenced before it dropped, which is that when you go into something with very low expectations, which is something which I think was the case for probably many of us this time around, aside from maybe the Formula Car, this one was a pleasant surprise for me. Not because I would call it a great update by any stretch, of course not. The vehicles which are there are, at the very least, pretty damn good to drive. And of course I did the little skit in the opening, which doesn't really do justice to the CHR. It's not a horrendous car or anything, but it does feel a bit jarring after driving the other ones. You go from a literal Grand Prix car to a 600 horsepower hot hatch that can take on supercars to a really iconic JDM legend, and then to the kind of car which I would probably hire when in South Africa. So it's not exactly kind of a consistent lineup. It is a more real-world-esque vehicle, which of course is great. That goes more so back to Gran Turismo's roots. It is a shame that it's kind of a Toyota train where that's happening with at the moment for the most part. A new car is a new car, and certainly a fresh face all around, not a returning one in any form in the Toyota CHR form. And one thing I will say positively about this update as a whole is that I really hope they continue this trend which they've had particularly in GT7 of having upgrades which are apropos to the car, and it feels more specific to a vehicle. Now not all of them have that same level of care and attention, some definitely don't, but this time around the Hyundai, for example, the IONIQ 5, you can basically turn it into a replica of the Pikes Peak machine, complete with the huge wide body, the massive rear wing, etc. Kind of an all-electric Escudo, if you will. Although I guess technically that would be the Tajima E-Runner, but you know what I mean. Likewise with the Grand Prix car, you would never really expect to have great aero modifications on a Grand Prix, but here we are. You can change the nose cone, you can change the wing, you can even change the snorkel arrangement right above the engine, and of course that in conjunction with liveries gives you so much room to play. Now for those who have already logged in, you will have seen of course that you can drive the Formula Car without actually buying it in the time trial events, which is where you can see me driving it here at Monza, but as it happens, it's pretty cheap. It's actually, you know, not even a legendary dealer car or anything like that, of course being fictional, that's not a surprise, but it's only 1 million credits. Really cheap for a Grand Prix car, and of course being a dealership car, that's not going to change. Aside from that, in fact, this is one of the most affordable updates we've ever had, which probably won't surprise many people. It's 85 grand for the Hyundai, 61 grand for the Civic, of course from the used dealer, so that'll be on rotation and that could change in future, and 26 grand, which is very, very cheap for the Toyota CHR. In terms of point levels and performance, well, very few updates are as wildly different between the top car and the lowest car this time around. The lowest one, of course, is the Toyota at 356 points and 136 horsepower, and then, of course, on the extreme opposite end, you've got the Grand Prix car with 984 points, just under 1,000 if you give it soft tyres and a race transmission, and, of course, 773 horsepower, and also, of course, less weight than the existing Grand Prix cars, being barely 500 kilos. Now, in the thumbnail, I've put some pretty big praise on these cars. To say that this is possibly, if not probably, my favourite Grand Prix car in Gran Turismo's history is a huge deal. You will have your own favourites, mostly depending on the kind of era of F1 which you love the most. For example, you've got the old school Honda Grand Prix, then you've got everything up to the legendary Formula Gran Turismo in the older games, and of course, back in Gran Turismo 3, there were others as well. You've got Senna's Lotus, the Mercedes, of course, which is one of the newest examples. It's got to be between the F10 and this one for me. I don't know if this would edge out the Ferrari F10, because that really is a fantastic car back in Gran Turismo 5, but this is pretty close, and I love this one because most of the F1 cars which I do really like tend to be from this kind of era. Of course, I always go on about the CVT transmission Williams, of course I love that one, albeit only in test car form. Of course, I'm a huge fan of the Benetton B186. I'll put out a call, as many of you will have seen earlier on today, and this kind of era is the shape which I find probably the prettiest from most F1 cars. The reason why I love the car so much, though, is actually not so much about the looks, it's of course about how it drives. One of the things which always bugs me about these older cars, as ballistic as they are, is the massive turbo lag. It's always there, you're always fighting against it, whereas this, with that lovely screaming naturally aspirated engine, with a bit less power and a bit less weight, it just feels like exactly my kind of thing. Almost more of like what you'd expect from a super Formula car, but with that old school vibe and the old school looks, and if you were looking forward to this, I don't really see how you could be disappointed by it. Moving on to the Hyundai IONIQ 5N, this is the one which I was most curious about to see what it could do, as I'm sure many of us were, but this is definitely the standout. This one, as fast and as fun as the F1 car is by far the best car of this update in terms of what it can just do all round. If you haven't driven it yet, and of course this is only my opinion, but we'll get more into it in its own review in a few days' time, if you essentially took like an R35 Nismo or a 911 Turbo and squashed it down into a retro futuristic looking hot hatch, that's basically what it drives like. Infinite overtake boost, you've got fantastic handling despite being, and I hadn't really thought about this before, literally the same weight as my real world Lincoln Continental, which is a ridiculous thing to say about any hatchback, let alone a modern one, but yeah, insanely heavy at 2.2 tons. Thankfully, supercar levels of power and torque, and the price tag isn't really that bad. Thankfully, can modify the car as well, so a huge step up there over many of the Vision GT versions of electric cars, not just for the visuals with the big aero and all that. You can majorly drop the weight on this, from 2.2 tons to a still hefty, but reasonable by today's standards, 1500. 700 kilos is a huge amount of weight to drop out of a car. I mean, in real life, you'd have to basically cut the battery pack out of this thing probably to get it down to that level. That essentially takes it from being, as I said, like a Rolls-Royce or a Lincoln weight to literally more like a Ford Focus kind of weight with 680 horsepower. It doesn't feel ballistic to drive as you might expect from something like a, ludicrous mode Tesla, for example, but as you can tell from the footage, it's more than quick enough to keep up with pretty much any sports car or supercar, even in completely standard form, which is what I'm driving here. The only potential downside is the lack of diff tuning that of course usually goes along with these electric cars due to their nature, but honestly here it doesn't even matter. It's a great car to work with and it really does not feel anywhere near as heavy as it is. It feels heavy, but it doesn't feel like 2.2 tons. As far as the Civic goes, I know many of you were really looking forward to this one. It's still curious how there are certain major Civics missing from this game, and also in some cases from the whole franchise. An FN Civic has still never been featured in Gran Turismo. Of course, the FD2 is missing still from Gran Turismo 6. Probably most notably the EP Civic, one of the fan favourites, is still not in there. The DC5 Integra, there are some very odd, notable omissions as well, not just from Honda, but they are kind of a prime example. This one is a great car. As a non-Civic mega fan who likes certain Civics here and there, but doesn't go crazy for them like so many JDM heads do, well, I love the car. It's super fun to drive, doesn't feel like it needs all the power in the world. As it happens, you can already Integra swap it, which is pretty cool as well, and you can make some pretty nice replicas of old school race cars, etc. If you were looking forward to it, much like the F1 car, you're not going to be disappointed. And as you can kind of tell, that seems to be the theme of 1.55. If you were looking forward to this, you're not going to be disappointed by it, in the form of the Hyundai, the F1, and this one. They're all living up to, if not exceeding, the expectations of what you'd expect, and that's great to see. That of course brings us to the CHR. This is a bit of a weird one. As I said earlier on, it very much so has the vibe of something like a Nissan Magnite or a Toyota Starlet or any of the other cars which we've hired when we hop over every so often to South Africa, and it is exactly that kind of vibe. It's got a very limited top speed of up around 90 miles an hour or so it certainly isn't beating most things in a straight line. Even here in standard form, I was using it on one of the new 450 point events, and it can just about win, but it's only because of the cornering where you can outmaneuver the AI. In a straight line, they catch up real quick, as you'd expect. You can do some interesting visual mods to it as well, which is kind of funny, with stuff like a rally-inspired rear wing. Of course, you can technically wide-body it. I haven't double-checked, and of course you could put down in the comments if that makes a difference. With the Hyundai, for example, it definitely does. I'm not sure about this car. This is the kind of update which I wasn't expecting much from. For many of us, it was a disappointment. Certainly not having a track will be the biggest downside for many people. This is the kind of case where you're pleasantly surprised by the cars, but underwhelmed by the rest. The new races are fairly pitiful. They're 3. You can use the new cars and they're done in like 5 minutes. You basically saw me do them almost in the time it takes to make this video. And in terms of other stuff, you've got the Group C collection book. You've got some new scapes. Again, who really cares? You've got some new motor swaps. We'll get into that tomorrow. Some pretty cool choices of car for the motor swap. Some classics, Citroen DS, for example, and a few others as well. So like I said, stick around for that tomorrow. I will be diving deeper into all of those new swaps. And of course, speaking of diving deeper, we will be talking in the subsequent days after that, over the weekend and into next week, about the individual cars in a more in-depth way. So all of the specs, what they're like, getting a chance to see some of those visual mods and liveries in action. So that's it for my initial thoughts and first impressions on 1.55, and let me know down below. And of course, if you were maybe holding off until seeing reviews, or just in general plan to skip it, has this maybe changed your mind, or are you still just going to wait until February? I wouldn't say I blame you if you were going to wait. You'll definitely enjoy the cars, but you also won't be missing too much if you just wait until next month. I'll see you tomorrow with more GT7 content though, and thanks for watching.